Hello, and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alistair.
And this fortnight we are talking about Jessica Jones Season 2, the return of Marvel's tortured noir detective, and we will also be asking, in a question that in no way gives a clue about what I thought of Jessica Jones Season 2, what makes a good, difficult second album? So all that's complicated processing of our feelings to come, but before all that, Alistair, what else have you consumed in the last 2 weeks, if you've had time with 13 hours of Jessica Jones to watch?
I've seen a show that you may have heard of. It's been getting some attention on social media, in the press and things like that. A little-known West End show called Hamilton.
This is just gloating, isn't it?
Yeah, at this point it's just gloating over the people who haven't seen it yet.
Such as me.
Yeah, primarily you in this case, yeah. Yeah, it's the New York show. It's on in London now. Tickets are sold out for about 10 years or something like that. I don't know. They're difficult to come by. We were going to see in the first 2 weeks or so that it was when it was opening, originally scheduled to open last November, but due to, I think, the theatre not being quite ready yet, our tickets had to be rescheduled to March. But it was worth the wait. It's a really, really good show. I had a great time. Before seeing it, I spoke to a friend of mine who is a huge Hamilton fan who'd actually flown to New York to see the New York version because she couldn't wait to see it in London. And I asked her basically, how should I approach this show?
How many history books should I read on a scale of 1 to 20?
It's not so much the history. So I was familiar with the broad strokes, but it was more, should I be approaching this more like a play when I kind of want to know as little as possible because, I want to be surprised by the story? Or should I approach it more like a gig when I want to know the material as well as possible so I can have that moment of, oh, it's that song that I love, rather than the songs all being fresh? And my friend said, you should approach it more like a gig. Like, you'll get more out of it if you know the songs well and if you're more invested in it. And which was great advice. So I was listening to the soundtrack a lot and really got to know the songs. And yeah, when they performed some of my favourites live, that was spectacular.
Okay, yeah, because I have tickets for... So, it's not that much of bitterness from my end. I have tickets for late April. Although there is some bitterness that I have tickets booked from months ago, and yet you got cancelled from March and still saw it before me. But yeah, I guess I should probably at least listen to the soundtrack at least once before I see it in late April then.
I think you'll get more out of it if you know the songs well. I approached it like I would approach a gig. Like in the run-up, I sort of rotate the albums of the band I'm going to see more and more into my listening, to the point when in the few days before the gig, I'm listening to pretty much nothing but their material. So I'm just completely mainlining it. And then when you see it live, yeah, it's an amazing experience. And that's what I did with Hamilton, and it was great fun.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to it. I was kind of interested on how it would go, considering that it's a sort of a story that obviously not the whole American founding fathers thing that we don't have that much connection with, whereas I hear they love that shit in America. But yeah, I guess apparently it's got enough buzz now that it seems to be doing okay anyway.
Yeah, Hamilton is probably a figure who's better known in America, I guess, where they learned about him in school.
Pretty sure I couldn't have told you anything about him before the musical came along, and now I can tell you that he's the lead character of the musical Hamilton.
Yeah, so he's a man who had a very interesting life. I can see why Lin-Manuel, when he read a biography of Hamilton, had this moment of like, wow, this would make a great musical. This is an amazing story. The guy had such an interesting life, so many twists and turns.
I like how you've already reached a point of extreme fandom where you're referring to the creator by his first name as if you're friends.
Oh, it's Lin-Manuel Miranda, isn't it? Yeah. Oh yeah, so I've listened to enough of his material. I feel like we're buddies now. Just like I feel like I'm good friends with Ian Banks after reading all his books. But I really enjoyed it, and some of the performance was amazing. The guy playing Aaron Burr in the London stage version is absolutely phenomenal. Yeah, real captivating presence. Again, one of those people that your eyes always on him whenever he's on stage. The guy playing Hamilton was superb as well. The whole cast really. But everyone distinguished themselves. But the guy who did Aaron Burr was excellent and kind of really brought a sense of nuance to Burr, who's such an interesting historical figure. So he's mainly been pilloried by history because he was the man who shot Hamilton. But
spoilers, come on now.
Everyone knows that, surely.
I'm British, damn it. I wasn't joking, I barely know who he is. Really?
You probably should familiarise yourself a bit with, unless you want to approach it entirely like a play, the whole thing is just a surprise. But it was good. I would recommend getting tickets. If you're sort of on the fence and you're of the opinion of, no, I'm not a big fan of musical theatre, or, I'm not a big fan of sort of rap and R&B as a genre, yeah, then I would say go, because I don't see a huge number of musicals. I do like to see things in the West End, but I lean more towards plays rather than musicals. But I absolutely loved it, and if anyone's umming and ahhing, it's a great night out. So if you can get tickets, I would highly recommend getting them.
And I actually like musicals, so I'm looking forward to it considerably.
Anyway, that was me. Nick, what have you been up to recently?
I've been listening to another popular thing, possibly not as popular as Hamilton, but still, this is the podcast Buffering the Vampire Slayer, which is doing a decent job of bringing Buffy back into the zeitgeist around its 20th anniversary. This is a podcast by Jenny Owen Youngs and Kristen Russo, in which they watch an episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer every week, talk about it for an hour to an hour and a quarter, and then each week they do a little song about it. It's a nice touch. I do enjoy a good bit of novelty music. I mean, I like Buffy anyway, so I would probably have listened to a decent Buffy recap podcast, but having a bit of novelty music at the end definitely sells it for me. And they're actually really good as well. Like, Jenny Owen Youngs is an actual musician for her day job, unless this podcast is now her day job, I'm not sure, but she is a working musician, and therefore the songs are all really good. Especially, they were quite good in season 1, but they have definitely gone to another level in seasons 2 and 3. Like, the songs from seasons 1 I listened to and thought, yeah, that was nice. The songs from seasons 2 and 3 I might actually listen to outside of the podcast. And yeah, just in general, it's a good chat about Buffy the Vampire Slayer in the way that you do with sort of these recap podcasts, where you look back and go, well, we mostly love this. Some of it is now clearly problematic. The character of Xander has not aged overly well, it seems, because, yeah, it seems since the 90s, the sort of nice guy nerd who desperately wants a girlfriend but can't because he knows he's just too nice, and therefore just sort of obsesses over them instead, perhaps doesn't go over as sympathetically as it used to, because some of those people have turned out to be kind of cunts.
Yeah, so, I think Ross from Friends has poisoned that well.
Yeah, it's unclear if you connect Xander more directly to Chandler or Ross, but yeah, Xander does appear to be the Ross of Buffy, and he seems to be the character who has aged particularly badly. But anyway, yeah, it's an interesting chat. They clearly love it, and they're clearly enjoying it, and the enthusiasm is infectious. So if you like Buffy and want to, cruise along and sort of it's a nice balance between the sort of the interesting analysis and actually, critiquing it in a not completely blind way, but actually also, being genuinely excited and invested and not just destroying it. Yeah, I don't know. I know some people can be a bit sort of, no, just talk about how great it is. Don't actually analyse it. Don't bring your modern politics into it. But I think, much like the West Wing Weekly, I think they bring a good balance of those perspectives. Recommended.
I think if you want to do a good recap podcast, you have to talk about how something has aged. It seems strange to me that you just want to basically just fawn over how great something was and kind of enjoy, kind of just revisit the episode, because maybe there's an attempt to recapture the joy people had when they first saw these things when we were maybe younger and less critical, or, our views at the time weren't as nuanced about characters like Ross or Xander. But I think if you've got to look back at something with the perspective of some distance, even if it's like 10, 15 years, then, you have to kind of talk about how the world has changed since then. It would be strange to sort of gloss over things like that. And I don't think it's bad to admit that it's not like you're saying this show is terrible and should be like condemned for all of history because it's got some problematic elements in it. You can say like, it's interesting to say this was like acceptable at the time, now it's not. Shall we discuss that? It's not the same as pillorying something.
It's actual, analysis. I mean, these things are borderline historical material at this point. I mean, it's been 20 years. I mean, this is the equivalent of me in the 90s when Buffy was actually on. If I watched something from the 70s, I wouldn't go, well, this basically represents the current culture. I'd be like, good God, what am I watching? Is this our world? I mean, although, TV production hasn't taken quite the same quantum leap since the 90s, so maybe it's harder to feel quite that level of disconnect, but I still think, culture has changed. It's okay to acknowledge that by actually discussing it, but that it's also okay to go, but, it was made in that different culture, therefore it's not actually evil.
Yeah, it would be like if you were in the time of Buffy looking back to Happy Days.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, but I think it's no coincidence that the recap shows that actually succeeded have been the ones that have tempered the fanishness with, actual analysis. I think going too hard either direction would probably lose either half of the audience. As with all things, there's a balance in there somewhere.
I think doing the songs is an interesting idea. There are a lot of recap podcasts out there, so I think you do, at this point, if you want to do one, you have to find some way to distinguish yourself, such as the West Wing Weekly, by having actual cast members involved and like interviews with creators, or if this is more of a fan project, but they've managed to find an interesting take by writing songs and stuff. So I think you need to bring that to stand out.
It's a combination of the songs and the sort of faddish enthusiasm. At this point, they've got a nice sort of community of guests they bring on and stuff, and it's a very warm, friendly experience listening to Buffy. I mean, I think you probably do have to, have some investment in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but if you do, then, which I do because it was one of the first shows I really got into, then yeah, go for it. There is a lot of commercialism in it nowadays. The degree of subscribe to our Patreon, buy our merch, why not buy these vitamin supplements, has got a bit. This is on the verge of taking me out of the show, guys. But not quite, I'm still with you.
I guess it's difficult to make a living as a fan creator.
Yeah, well, Alistair, this is just how the more professional podcasts do it. Incidentally, for the love of God, buy my books.
First up this episode, we will be discussing the second series of Jessica Jones. This series picks up where last year's Defenders left off, with Jessica back behind her desk, running her private investigator business and drinking heavily. Just as she starts to pull her life back together, a client is killed outside her flat, and the resulting investigation forces Jessica to dig into her own past. We've seen the entire second series, so Nick, overall, what did you think of it?
Overall, I think I feel some disappointment, I will admit. It's a shame, as I did really like Season 1, and Season 2, although there were some interesting ideas in it, I think it got hit quite heavily with, I don't know, what I guess you can call Netflix Marvelitis, in that it felt very, this is a one story stretched out very thin over 13 episodes, and although it has the occasional good moment, it's just too slow. And also, I don't know, I felt like the story itself wasn't quite good enough to really stand up to that level of extreme scrutiny over 13 quite slow episodes. So yeah, to be honest, since we changed the format of this podcast to one thing a fortnight, we've kind of done things we liked. And, we both really liked Season 1 of Jessica Jones, so I kind of thought this would be another moderately good slam dunk. But no, this didn't do a huge amount for me, TBH. It had a few fun moments, and I have a certain lingering affection for the characters, but I thought this was actually probably on the average to low average end of the Marvel Netflix stuff. How about you?
Yeah, it's a difficult one for me to put my thoughts together on. I only saw the final episode last night, so in some ways I'm still sort of gathering my thoughts, but I definitely get the sense of disappointment. But one thing I'm finding it hard is that, I enjoyed the first series so much. I really liked it. Anything was going to be a disappointment compared to it. I mean, I remember when I was watching Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, I think we talked about this on the podcast, and I had this moment of just, in the cinema, being like, this is just not as good as the first one. And then I was like, yeah, but the first one was such this kind of wow moment, and it was so unexpectedly good. Yeah, that nothing's going to kind of live up to that sense of wow again, especially a direct sequel. So yeah, finding it hard to think that I feel let down by this show, but did I set my expectations too high, especially after feeling a bit let down by Iron Fist and Defenders being on the whole good but not great, and I kind of really stoked my enthusiasm for Jessica Jones Series 2, and maybe I set my expectations too high, but I certainly agree with you that it sort of rambled. There wasn't enough focus. There were some good bits, but it didn't really work as an overall story, and it was, like you say, too thin, stretched out. I kind of felt that the first series seemed to have something it really wanted to say, about abuse and about how men treat women, and the fact that all the women in the show had been abused in some way or some form. And there was something about, how Kilgrave was so charming and nice and likable, but had this really nasty side to him. It had something it took this kind of superhero, superpowered woman versus kind of evil megalomaniac superpowered dude, and then kind of found a way to tell a story that really relates to people's everyday experiences, like a kind of fantasy metaphor for real life. And I was kind of searching for that in this second series, and I felt it didn't really have something it kind of wanted to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's still clearly trying to do that to some extent, in that there's a bit where Trish, the character, incidentally, there'll probably be moderate spoilers. I probably don't need to actually describe what happens in the final episode, but I'll probably be dropping bits in. So if you fear the spoiler, then at this point you've probably heard our general opinions. You might want to fast forward to the next bit. The timestamps are in the episode description on the website and iTunes. Anyway, yeah, there's a bit where Trish confronts a movie director who abused her when she was younger and on the way up, which is obviously a fairly direct shout out to Me Too and stuff. And that's on the one hand, that's the sort of thing this show should probably be addressing, because it set its stall out as an aggressively feminist show, and it actually does a reasonably good job of actually centering its female characters in the narrative. Nearly every major character is a woman. I think this season all or most of the writers and directors were women as well. So it's actually, it is walking that walk as well as talking the talk, and it's a good thing for it to talk about. It's a reasonable plot for the Trish character as well, that is her background. But it's sort of really crowbarred into this storyline because the reason they're doing this is so that the director can get her some medical records that relate to the main conspiracy storyline. It's like, okay, I mean, so even the bits where they're actually doing, interesting, relevant things along roughly the right lines, it just felt a bit patchwork and random. And all the fact that it does actually have something to say does put it a level above, again, we're probably going to invoke this a few times, Iron Fist, because Iron Fist really did just feel like inane punching for no reason. But it just felt kind of shonky and half-baked, which is disappointing considering due to the Defenders' schedule rotation bollocks, they've had like 2 years to make this. So the fact that it feels so thin and, to be honest, so much like a lot of it was written 10 minutes before it was filmed is a bit weird.
Yeah, the plot, like I say, the fact the plot rambles, you'd think if you had 2 years to make a TV show, you would come up with a tighter structure that, it did seem to just sort of shoot off in sort of different directions. And it didn't really all like come together at the end.
Yeah, the conspiracy plotline to give her... because what they're looking into is the conspiracy that gave Jessica her powers when she was in a car accident and kidnapped from the hospital. The conspiracy feels a bit generic. Although also, Jessica is the most unlucky person in the world, isn't she? I mean, this happened to her because she happened to be in the wrong hospital. And then Kilgrave abducted her and horribly abused her because she bumped into him walking down the street.
Yeah.
I mean, I can see why she's so unhappy. The woman has no luck.
Yeah.
I'm Jessica Jones, and that's why I drink.
Well, isn't it because Kilgrave sees that she's really, really strong? That's why he takes an interest in her, because of her strength.
Ah, possibly.
Yeah. I think you're right that Jessica is really unlucky in life, but that's kind of the point, I think, in the character. That's the sense that it is trying to say something, in that Jessica just wants to live a normal life. But society, basically because she's a woman and weaker than a lot of people in society, I mean, politically, socially, or whatever, and when she's a child, obviously also physically, because she's weaker than other people, society basically decides it doesn't want to just leave her alone. It wants to fuck with her against her will. I think that's kind of the point, is that Jessica is a moody and sort of angry and dislikable person because society has driven a train wreck through her life, basically because it can.
Yeah.
In a perfect world, Jessica would just like to be alone and run her private investigative business, making money, just taking pictures of men cheating on their wives.
It's true. I mean, yeah, as much as I enjoy my facetious criticism, yes, I suspect a lot of that is just, why do these things keep happening to Jessica Jones? Because we're trying to make a point here. She's in a TV show.
Yeah. I mean, I thought there's some interesting stuff exploring themes related to addiction in this series. You've got bits about Malcolm and his, recovery from being an addict in the first series. Trish, who's also a recovering addict, is sort of falling back into addiction, dealing with her own sort of personal demons and abuse. There's a sort of plot line involving the sort of inhaler that made you sort of super strong and super fast from the first series, which turns out to be quite addictive and quite bad for you. So at first I thought they were going to explore abuse or substance abuse and addiction in this series in the way that they'd explored, say, physical and emotional abuse in the last series, but it didn't really sort of come together.
They seem to fall back quite a lot on the beat of Trish for various reasons relating to her addiction does something to screw Jessica over, and that happened about 5 times, and by about the 3rd time it's like, I'm not saying this isn't necessarily a realistic series of behaviours for an addict, but I'm not sure you're dramatising it very interestingly. It just seems a bit, every other episode Trish fucks up.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm aware that we may have exposed that my memory of season 1 is getting increasingly vague, but I don't remember Trish's addiction being this front and centre and her fallibility being quite this phenomenal in season 1, so it did seem to really balloon upwards out of nowhere in season 2.
Well, the main point in season 1, Trish, is that she's also recovering from an abusive relationship, but it's an abusive relationship with her mother, not an abusive relationship with a boyfriend, I suppose, as Jessica's has been, or boyfriend/partner. And the kind of fact that she's a recovering addict is more the fact that she became an alcoholic and a drug addict because she was abused. That's why I really like about the first series, is that it all kind of links back to the point that, the strong in society abuse the weak for their own desire, and this ruins people's lives. So the kind of addiction was kind of a part of Trish's background as an abuse survivor. And which I think was interesting this series, that they had a sense of, in the last series, Trish was containing her addiction whilst she was dealing with abuse, her abusive past. But in this series, she can't contain her addiction. What I quite liked about this series is there was a sense of how sort of everything fell apart for all the characters. Like in the last series, they were held together because of this big external threat. which was Kilgrave, and they had to keep it all in check because they realised they had to work together to stop him. And then I quite like the fact in this series, everyone's lives and relationships fell apart because they don't have that big kind of external threat keeping them together. This series, I think, focused more on how the characters relate to each other and the stresses of their various dysfunctional relationships.
Yeah, I think, like I always say about these Netflix shows, I always feel like they really, really need to have either shorter seasons or actual episodic plots. Like, I feel like I would have probably found stuff like the Trish subplot a bit less repetitive if I didn't have to stare at it for like half an hour every episode. Like, if there'd actually been something happening beyond just that. Like, if, you know, they'd actually... I mean, she runs, as I always say about Jessica Jones, she runs a detective agency, for God's sake. Just give her some more cases. Just have her, you know, take on another case every 2 or 3 episodes, just to, you know, so it feels like the show is ticking over in a more watchable way. I mean, these episodes are an hour long. You've definitely got time.
Yeah, I think a bit more of an episodic structure would have worked better, or it being shorter. And also the detective stuff seemed to kind of go out the window. After a while, she wasn't really trying to solve a case. She was just sort of on a sort of bizarre, quite slow-moving journey.
Well, the same thing happened last season. It's just that I was more entertained by that journey, so I didn't care as much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can see the desire to not try and directly compete with David Tennant or / Kilgrave by bringing in another great big charismatic villain. I mean, partly because he's a hard act to follow, and partly because I guess you don't want your show about putting women centre stage to be defined by, holy shit, look at the man villain every year.
Yeah.
But, I don't know. Part of it was rather they'd have created a memorable female villain rather than avoiding villains entirely.
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of dancing around some of the stuff in the second half when the kind of main plot, I guess, really gets going, because I guess we don't avoid spoilers too much.
Well, no, as I say, I've already done a more or less spoiler warning. So yeah, final spoiler warning for the midway twist, I suppose.
Yeah.
About halfway through the season, Jessica Jones's thought dead mother, Elisa, turns up. And it turns out to have also been experimented on, and then the second half of the season is mostly about Jessica and her relationship.
Yeah.
And it gives it a nice bit of momentum for a couple of episodes, and then I feel like it kind of dies off again.
Yeah, I mean, there's some interesting things, again, in the sense of, like, they've created, like, a complex character in the mother that, like, she's sort of sympathetic and unsympathetic. She's sympathetic because she didn't ask to be experimented on, same as Jessica. She just wants to, you know, trying to have a normal family life to some degree, but is also powerful and dangerous and is worried about hurting her daughter, and also just has killed people who aren't always, again, minor characters who aren't sympathetic, but there's always a sense of, like, that boyfriend of Jessica Jones who she inadvertently kills in a flashback is like, he is a little bit of a shit, but probably didn't deserve to have his skull bashing against a concrete wall.
Part of me feels disappointed that they went all the way in making him a bit of a shit before killing him. I always thought it would have been more interesting if she just killed him on a bit of a whim because he seemed like he might be a bit of a shit, but no, they went all in making him a bit of a dickbag before she bashed his head.
Yeah, but still, I mean, like, as much as I don't like dickbag boyfriends, should it be a capital crime?
It probably was not a death penalty offence, no. Talking a bit of shit about your girlfriend behind her back. He probably just deserved a mild punch rather than having the inside of his head bashed out.
Yeah, so they managed to create some nuance with the mother character, and there's a sense of, like, you know, Jessica realises she does have to protect people at large, and her mother is dangerous. Jessica's not entirely self-absorbed. She's not like, screw other people, I've got my mother back. You know, her mother is clearly dangerous. And also, it's complicated with her mother. Her mother has, again, been experimented on, abused to some degree. But also, you know, there's the question of, similar to Kilgrave was experimented on and is abused to some degree. But there was a degree to which you're responsible for their own actions. Kilgrave hurts people. Jessica's mother hurts people. There's an interesting question going on here about, like, to what degree do you take responsibility for your actions? At what point are you culpable for the people you hurt? Yeah,
that is an interesting question, and again, I felt like it would probably have been more potent, not spread out over about 7 episodes, but Rachel McTeer as Elisa, Jessica's mother, was pretty good, and the couple of episodes where they actually meet and talk over their relationship are actually mostly quite good. The ending was a bit, on some level, kind of predictable, and it took about... And what felt like it should have been like the 1 hour finale took about 3 episodes to play out.
Yeah.
Mostly it's just a bit Netflix. I really wish they'd mix up their approach to these shows a bit more, because I've now watched about 7 or 8 of... Is this the 8th? The 8 of these? And...
I think so, yeah.
The amount of them, but I've actually come away thinking, yes, that was a good 13-hour show. That needed to be a 13-hour show is quite small.
Yeah, this series also, I guess, like, minor points, does something that, like, premium TV seems to do quite regularly that I find actually quite annoying, which is basically the mid-season flashback episode that fills in stuff we already know. This one, it was episode 8. I remember that, like, American Gods did this as well. It's basically some events happened in the past. All the main characters have discussed this, So we know what those events are. But now we're going to get to the point when they become relevant, where we're going to flashback and you're going to see played out what you already know because the characters have discussed these events. But now you get to actually see them happen pretty much as they were discussed. I mean, American Gods, I think, was worse for this. There's just an element of, like, this is not necessary.
See, I actually preferred American Gods to this just because I felt like American Gods actually illuminated the characters a bit by doing this, whereas this really was just, here's some stuff. With the exception of the boyfriend and his death, which you could have done in about a quarter of the length. You already knew most of this. I didn't like that episode particularly.
Yeah, and the other thing which I found somewhat disappointed was the plot involving the super boyfriend. Not super as in superhero, super as in superintendent.
Oh, yeah, him.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't bad. I just felt it was so predictable. I was like, vaguely nice dude has been introduced to the plot. Yeah, that's going to be the love interest for this series. And despite the fact there's a little kind of, at first they don't like each other, then they do like each other, I was a bit like, this is a pretty straightforward romance subplot. It's not really adding anything to the show.
I quite liked the actor. As a general good-looking guy to be a love interest, he had a certain sort of charisma and chemistry with Kristen Ritter. As a love interest, I've seen a lot worse. But yeah, his plot was a bit predictable.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with him. I mean, it was one of those things, it was fine. But fine is not what I've come to expect from Jessica Jones, given the first series. So.
Yeah, in a weird way, I quite liked the Jerry Hogarth plot with the Carrie-Anne Moss character. I actually thought it was ridiculously separate from everything else, to the extent that it does seem to have largely come out of a we need to give her something to do meeting. But I thought she carried it well. Because it wasn't in quite as many scenes as the other stuff, at least it always felt like it was moving forward.
Yeah, I like that. It was good. Like I say, it was pretty much separate from the main plot, only overlapping a little bit. But I thought Carrie-Anne Moss played the part really, really well.
So I liked the bit where this is a massive pointless spoiler I'm going to bring in just so I can do a joke. I like the bit where she leaves the company and takes her clients with her, and then she throws the dialogue is something like, I'm taking my clients with me, including Rand. You know, it's good that among all this intensity they've taken the time to set up that she can still be in Iron Fist Season 2.
Yeah, I guess it's the internal universe continuity.
Also, that cameo from Foggy from Daredevil was just weird.
It didn't seem too forced. I mean, she needed a subordinate to yell at in one scene, so it kind of does make it seem like they're all in the same universe to have, Foggy turn up. And there's little things that kind of does make it all fit together, like how...
It's a nice little nod. It's just always a bit sort of, oh, okay. He really is just coming in one scene to be yelled at. I sort of genuinely assumed this was setting up him playing a bigger role in that episode, or maybe Daredevil showing up would have been a bit too much to ask. But yeah, I just found it quite funny.
There are little internal continuity nods, like the super boyfriend's son has like a Captain America toy, which I thought was quite cool. And, they mentioned the raft.
Yeah, also at one point someone opens fire on them with a sniper rifle, and I really for a second hoped it might be the Punisher. It was not the Punisher.
No, there was another supporting plot line that didn't really go anywhere, involving a rival PI.
It did feel a bit middle chapter of trilogy in a way, and a lot of the way it ended out, and I'm actually not going to bother spoiling all of it because there's no point, did seem to be getting things in line for a possible third season. Maybe they'll redeem it all, who knows. Yeah,
good cliffhanger endings. I'm interested to see where it goes in the next series, but we won't say what, obviously, but I quite like the final episode. It sort of put a nice kind of ending on it.
It was a bit predictable. Well, the actual last 10-15 minutes were actually quite good. There was some good, powerful, focused Jessica Jones scenes that made me think, wow, where was this for the rest of the season? So yeah, as I think I said at the beginning, on the general Marvel Netflix hierarchy I keep in my head, I think this is probably dipping towards the sort of lower mid section. It's definitely above all that shit with the hand, but I don't know if it's above that much else.
Yeah.
Definitely below stuff I genuinely liked, like Punisher, Cage, and obviously the first season of this.
It's kind of, I think, it was about maybe as good as the middle bit of Daredevil Season 2.
Yeah, that level of sort of okayishness, yeah.
It's better than the end of Daredevil Season 2 when it's all just about the hand and it's just all a bit crap. But it's not as good as the beginning of Daredevil Season 2 when it's Daredevil and the Punisher, and actually, again, it's got something to say about vigilantes and which side of the law you come down on.
Well, yes, obviously, as I said, I think it's better than anything that's involving the hands, because as I've said millions of times on this podcast, I can't fucking stand them.
Next, we will be discussing what makes a good, difficult second album. The first series of Jessica Jones was a huge hit. I talked quite a bit in the section we just did about how much I liked it and how it meant that I set the bar quite high for the second series. The first series blazed the trail through my corner of social media like wildfire. Everyone was talking about it. Huge expectations for the second series, which is typical of the difficult second album. You can't see again because it's an audio medium. I'm doing air quotes on this. So Nick, do you think this show has a difficult second album problem?
It definitely had a difficult second album problem. The first season was amazing, and the main problem was the first season really made me feel strong, intense feelings that often Marvel shows kind of struggle to make you hit. It often is just about people hitting stuff, whereas the first season of Jessica Jones was actually quite hard going. Like, I was watching it with Julianne Benford, my girlfriend and former podcast guest, and she actually didn't particularly like watching more than one episode in a single sitting. Unfortunately, we weren't watching it for a podcast deadline, so we didn't have to, because she found it quite tough and upsetting. And I was basically okay with that, because I would admit, I marathon a lot of quite punishing TV, and even I found it quite hard. And the second season, outside of everything we just said, definitely did not keep that feeling of hard intensity. It did just feel a lot more like an urban sci-fi fantasy Marvel show, without that extra edge of it burns. So yeah, there's definitely an edge that's gone somewhere.
I think it's a lot to do with the kind of how high, I mean, for me, it had to do with how high I set the expectations, in that I don't think Jessica Jones Series 2 was, like I say, as bad as some of the stuff involving the hand, but the sense of disappointment, is palpable because of how far I set the bar up for this show. I mean, The Defenders I quite liked because it involved the hand, but wasn't terrible. So which I give it credit for, but that's because the Hand is like a band that's put out a series of like rubbish albums and you don't pay any attention to them, and then when they put out a decent one you're like, oh, actually no, this is worth listening to. Whereas, I don't know, Jessica Jones Series 2 reminds me really of a band I really like called Slaves, who are a punk band. They released the first album, which is called Are You Satisfied? And it's really, really good. And it's really political, and it's really angry, and it's like everything good punk music should be. Then they released the second album, which was called Take Control. And it's just archetypal, difficult second album. It's clearly been done too quickly. It's rambly, like Jessica Jones Series 2. There's lots of interesting little vignettes, but doesn't come together in a kind of sleek, efficient whole like the first album did. It's kind of full of lots of ideas, but no consistency. And it was a bit, when I was listening to it, was a bit like, well, it's not that this isn't good, but compared to the first one, I just feel really disappointed. And I have that feeling very much about Jessica Jones Series 2. So for me, if you look up difficult second album in the dictionary, it'll probably, sorry Slaves, be a picture of Take Control by Slaves.
See, part of me quite likes a good difficult second album, because I don't know, I quite enjoyed the feeling of someone who did really well last time trying desperately to react against it. It doesn't always lead to anything good, but it does often lead to something that's kind of interesting, or even the occasional good bit. I mean, my favourite difficult second album in the straight audio form is probably Neon Bible by Arcade Fire. I mean, I got kind of bored at Arcade Fire in actual recent years. Like, the last couple of albums, the most recent one especially, just sound very similar to each other. They've got this sort of clattering Arcade Fire sound, which was kind of cool and exciting when you first hear it, but by album number 5 has just worn away. But Neon Bible, possibly as a sort of reaction to how big their first album was, they actually try and do some quite weird things, like the title track and the song Black Mirror, which I'm never entirely sure if the TV show is named after or not, but it's a good song. And there's a song called The Well and the Lighthouse, and there's another song called Intervention. I really like all those songs. A lot of people have said that album is shit, and that my taste is awful. But about all the air quotes there, yeah. Yeah, and there are some songs on there that are bad, but that is my favourite difficult second album. I think they reacted to their regular sound, did some interesting things, got some lukewarm to terrible reviews, and then went back to making albums that sounded a lot like their first one, and then I got kind of bored of them. That's my favourite difficult second album, folks. The Killers also had a bit of a difficult second album, but not in a way I liked as much, as a lot of it's a bit dull.
I really like Sam's Town, actually. I think Sam's Town is one of the really underappreciated albums of the 2000s. Actually, because it had a whole story behind it and things like that, and there was like an emotional highs and lows. Whereas, Hot Fuss, the first album, is just 12 or so banging party tunes. I mean, they're good songs, but the second one has like emotional highs, emotional lows, story, nuance. I don't know. I always thought that was underappreciated second album.
I think it's good in places. I just find it a bit samey as a whole. I haven't listened to it all the way through for quite a long time, whereas there are other Killers albums. I think the next one, Day and Age, I quite like, which I get a lot more out of.
Yeah. But
yeah, the Killers also had a bit of a difficult second album. Of course, the recipe for that, I guess, is for a good difficult second album, is to, be successful, freak out a bit, try a new direction, and then discover that you're not quite as good at it, but you have still produced some interesting shit. And it's still better than the bland second album, where you just make the same thing again and you're not as good.
Yeah, and then usually fall back on just doing what you do well, like kind of over and over with diminishing returns, until eventually you've distilled your audience down to the people who just like you.
Yeah. In TV, of course, the most famous difficult second album of recent years is probably Heroes, which really...
Yeah.
had an amazing first year and then fell screaming off a cliff, trying desperately to both be the same and also different.
Yeah. 24 as well is one when I think that like the first series is really good and quite a good detective show and stuff, and then the second one is Jack Bauer nuts terrorists for 24 hours. Partly, actually, the issue with both Heroes and 24 is that they had quite a good concept, but then changed it up because the first series was so incredibly successful. So with 24, I think the original idea was that each series would be a different place of work and they wouldn't be related. So the first one's like 24 hours in counter-terrorism. The second one was going to be like 24 hours in a hospital. Kiefer Sutherland would still be Jack Bauer, but this time he'd be a doctor, and Palmer would be like the head of the hospital, not the president or whatever. But counter-terrorism was too hard to follow with something else, and people liked Jack Bauer and the characters with the first series, so I think there was an element of, we're just going to keep going with this. And similar with Heroes, I think there was supposed to be a self-contained story, and the second series was supposed to be basically all new heroes. Basically, first story wrapped up, it was going to be the same universe, people discovering superpowers, but it would be a whole new raft of characters. But then people like the cheerleader and the Japanese guy and Peter Petrelli and whatever, and so stick with those guys. So I think if your second album is going to be based on like really jazzing up the format, and then the last minute you decide to stick with the format, then it can be disappointing.
I mean, a lot of the mainstream stuff I like doesn't tend to jazz up the format that much, to be honest. I mean, if anything, yeah, a lot of the shows and film series and stuff that have succeeded have tended to just sort of consolidate in the second series and do something that's, you know, similar but slightly better and more focused. Whereas, yeah, people who have the weird desire to panic and do something radically different or something seems to be when you produce something that's just crap.
What I always thought was the archetypal difficult second album in TV is the new series of Doctor Who, actually. Yeah, well, what happens when you have this like difficult second album problem? It occurs when basically a band has a huge hit first album, and that's usually because they've spent years in obscurity tinkering and perfecting this album. Like, they've spent years on it because, you know, they're just working away, playing away, making this album better and better. Then it comes out and people are like, wow, it's really good, because obviously they spent ages making it really good. And then there's like, in its explosion, it becomes really popular, and then they're like, cool, that was great. Now, do it again, but this time you've got to do it in about 8 months while you're also touring that first album, which is why the second albums can be a bit shonky. And I think that's why, you know, Take Control by the Slaves is like, it's full of lots of little bits of good ideas, but it's kind of hard to coalesce it all together when you like I say, you've got to do it to a tight deadline. The way this relates to Doctor Who is that the first series of new Doctor Who is full of a lot of people who were like TV writers and also people who'd written for like Doctor Who magazine and things like that. And clearly, during the wilderness years when Doctor Who was off TV, these are people who've been, you know, every Doctor Who fan, especially every Doctor Who fan who's a writer, has got in their head, this is the story I'd like to tell with the Doctor. And these people must have been cooking it, you know, Stephen Moffat, Rusty Davies, all the rest of it, must have been cooking these plots for years, just by, if I could just give them the chance to write Doctor Who, this is what I would do. And then they did it in the first series, and that's why the first series is really strong. I mean, Christopher Eccleston maybe didn't achieve the heights of popularity as David Tennant or Matt Smith, but I think the writing in the first series and the plotting is really, really good. And then basically they're like, okay, now you've got to do it again. Again, you've only got about 6 months to write it all before we got to shoot the second series. And you're not just doing the idea you've been slowly cooking for 10 years while Doctor Who's been off TV. You've got to just kind of come up with something right now.
Yeah, I thought the second season was a bit weaker as well, but they did put it back. But yeah. And then, of course, Stephen Moffat, arguably, if anything, hit a similar difficult second album with his second series as showrunner, when he decided to try and really push for his big, massive, towering prog epic. And although that is another, to be honest, difficult second album I kind of like, because, yes, it probably ultimately kind of collapses, but at least it does it interestingly. But it is still definitely a difficult moment for him.
Yeah.
It definitely did not entirely work.
I think that's similar to also, like, the related of difficult second film, which occurs when, say, like, independent film director makes a good film on like low budget quite so concisely, and then basically that film is a huge hit, and basically they're like, okay, now make another film, but you've got huge amounts of money and huge amounts of creative freedom, and you're like, and then it goes like, okay, and then you get something that's maybe a bit self-indulgent or not quite as good.
I don't know if Duncan Jones has been going that way since Moon. It's hard to really tell.
Yeah, I was trying to think of a good example of that, and actually probably Duncan Jones is, although I quite like Source Code, but Moon is better.
Yeah, when I was thinking about films, I inevitably ended up mostly thinking about franchises, as they're all I ever watch. I ended up thinking about Age of Ultron, the second Avengers film, in which Joss Whedon tried to follow one of the most successful and legitimately best superhero films of all, and made something that just sort of felt like a slightly less good version of it, with lots of self-indulgent noodling.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. Age of Ultron is not the worst thing in the world, but it does seem like quite a rambly, compromised thing.
Yeah, it's a kind of mosaic of loads of little bits and pieces. I mean, yeah, again, it reminds me of Take Control in that it's got loads of little bits in it and they kind of some good ideas all scattered in there, but like it doesn't really come together as like one thing when kind of the point of the superhero team-up movies is like everyone coming together, which is why the Avengers Assemble works quite well.
Oh, yeah, I think, honestly, the more I think about it, the more Age of Ultron might actually have a lot in common with Jessica Jones Season 2. There's lots of stuff, there's lots of people and stuff flying around. A lot of the things I like are still there. A lot of the elements and creative things I like are still kind of there. It just doesn't come together as well. I can sort of see the joins too much. There's just too much random shit happening.
Yeah.
But at least it's not as slow.
I come up with some approaches to the difficult second album that might or might not work.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's... One option is wait ages to build some anticipation.
The Independence Day Resurgence approach.
Yeah, or the most famously, like the Stone Roses' Second Coming. Release an amazing album, everyone loves it. Wait 5 years. Is it 5 years? Longer than that. It's like 5 or 6 years. Wait 5 or 6 years while the anticipation really, really builds. So whatever you release is going to be a disappointment.
Nice.
Or there's the flip side, which is, like Blade Runner, release a sequel about 30 years after the original. No, even longer than 30 years, which has really built some anticipation. And it actually turned out to be really good. So yeah, building anticipation by waiting long. There's also the flip side, which is rush release something really quickly after your first album. So at least you get this difficult second one out of the way and then move on. Like Arctic Monkeys after their huge hit first album, Everything You Say I Am Not, they brought an EP out quite quickly. So I felt that was quite a good way of like, yep, there's the second bit, that's done.
Yeah.
We'll carry on. Yeah, so those are the kind of two approaches, either wait ages or just kind of get out of the way and then move on quickly.
Yeah, as I say, Jessica Jones had ages and it still wasn't that good. I mean, for some reason, in a lot of Hollywood series, the difficult second album seems to be replaced by the difficult third film. The number of trilogies that seem to fall apart at the end is, for some reason, quite high. I guess the level of self-indulgence just builds and builds.
And expectations as well.
Yeah, I guess once you've succeeded once, people are just, okay, interesting. Once you've succeeded twice, in a particularly big way, it must get a bit sort of, holy shit, yes, give them everything they want. And you're like, oh my god, everything.
Yeah.
And then sometimes bad things happen.
Yeah, Tobey Maguire Spider-Man, the original X-Men series.
To a lesser extent, but The Dark Knight.
This works quite well for superheroes. Godfather films, which is not a superhero, but similar. Sometimes, you get also like a difficult second album that is inevitably a disappointment compared to the first one, but still really, really good. And I think the obvious example of this is Oasis, in that What's the Story, Morning Glory is a really good album. It just doesn't quite live up to Definitely Maybe, which is one of my favourite albums.
I think that counts as surviving it, though,
Yeah.
You've just about done it. I don't think anyone sees Oasis as having, massively stumbled. I think Morning Glory is seen as some sort of classic in its own right.
Yeah, it was for a while the second highest selling British album of all time, beaten only by Sgt. Pepper's. I don't know if it's still got that title, probably. Like, the top 10 highest selling British albums of all time are all like Ed Sheeran at this point or something, due to some bizarre hack of Spotify. But yeah, Morning Glory was like a huge commercial success and like very popular, and also is very well received. But yeah, as everyone always says of Oasis, yeah, it's not Definitely Maybe though, is it?
Yeah, again, possibly displaying my complete lack of taste. I think I slightly prefer Morning Glory.
Yeah.
Okay, and that was Moderate Fantasy Violence. Thank you, as ever, for listening. If you've enjoyed this, you can review us on iTunes, and we would appreciate it, as I gather it somehow makes it come up higher in searches. You can also find more from us on our website at moderatefantasyviolence.com, including, I believe, a blog post from Alistair about his thoughts on the other Netflix Marvel shows and how they all interrelate to each other. You can also follow us on social media. If you go to Twitter, we are at MFV Podcast, or you can search for Moderate Fantasy Violence. You can also like us on Facebook, where we are Moderate Fantasy Violence. You can search for us there. Also, if you're interested in listening to a different podcast after you finish this one, we can recommend And Then What?, the podcast about stories. They recently did a live episode. We were there in the audience and we got a shout out at one point. If you're interested in more from me, you can follow me on Twitter, where I am at Alistair J.R. Ball. You can also get more of my writing at redtrainblog.com. Okay, and I am at NickMB on Twitter. There's also more from me at nickbryan.com, including at some point in the next few weeks an actual new website, which I've very slowly been making, and the 5th book in my Hobson and Shaw crime series, which, as I mentioned way back during the intro, you should definitely buy. Okay, and that really is it for this fortnight. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with the movie Isle of Dogs, which I gather Alistair is very excited for, so hopefully it'll get a better review. Thank you for listening. Bye. Bye. This is a podcast by Jenny Owen Youngs and Kirsten Vuso. Is it Kirsten or Kristen? That's going to annoy me. One moment, please, caller. Kristen. Yeah, I'm not putting this after the credits again. That's just ridiculous.
No, that was a callback.
It's people who care enough to listen to the entire fucking file.